I wasn't expecting Mike to come over that evening. He and my husband Dan had been friends for years. College buddies who stayed close, even after life took them in different directions. Mike would visit every now and then, usually for dinner or to catch a game with Dan. I always liked him. He was funny and easy to talk to. But I never thought of him as anything more than my husband's friend. Until that night. It was a Friday, and Dan had called me from work to say he'd be late. I've been looking forward to a quiet night by myself, maybe watching a movie, or finally getting around to that book I'd started months ago. But when the doorbell rang, I found Mike standing there, smiling like he always did, holding a six-pack in one hand. "Dan's not home yet," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Yeah, I know," he said, shrugging. "He told me to come by anyway. Thought I'd keep you company until he gets here." I didn't mind. Mike was always good company. And besides, it wasn't like we hadn't hung out before. I offered him something to drink, and we ended up in the kitchen, chatting while I finished preparing dinner. It was casual at first, just the usual small talk. He told me about his day, and I asked him about his latest work projects. But as the evening wore on, something shifted. I'm not sure when it happened, but at some point, the conversation became less about what we were saying, and more about how we were saying it. I caught myself laughing a little too hard at one of his jokes, and when our eyes met, I felt a flutter in my stomach that I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was nothing. We were just friends and I was being silly. But the way Mike was looking at me, it wasn't the way a man looks at his best friend's wife. Or maybe it was, and I just never noticed before. Either way, it made me nervous. I could feel the tension building between us, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. He leaned against the counter, his eyes lingering on me just a little too long. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "I don't think I've ever really told you how much I appreciate you. Karen, you're always so kind, so easy to talk to." I felt my cheeks flush and I looked away, busying myself with the food on the stove. "Well, I try," I said, my voice coming out a little more flustered than I intended. "Dan's lucky to have you as a friend." There was a pause, a long one, where I could feel his eyes on me, and for the first time I didn't know what to do with myself. I was suddenly aware of how close he was standing, of the space between us shrinking with every second that passed. My heart was pounding and I hated that this was Mike, for God's sake. He was practically family. But there was no denying the way he was looking at me. And even worse, there was no denying the way it made me feel. It had been so long since I'd felt that kind of attention from anyone. And it stirred something in me I thought had been long buried. "Karen," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face him, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air between us was heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite explain. His eyes searched mine, and I knew deep down that this was a line we were standing dangerously close to crossing. But before either of us could say anything else, the sound of the front door opening shattered. The moment Dan had finally come home, the sound of Dan's footsteps coming down the hallway was like a splash of cold water. I blinked, turning quickly back to the stove, trying to pretend that nothing had happened, that there hadn't been a shift between Mike and me. In those quiet seconds before Dan arrived, "Hey, babe," Dan called out, strolling into the kitchen with his usual relaxed energy. "Mike, you're here early." I forced a smile, grateful that Dan was oblivious to the tension hanging in the room. "Dinner's almost ready," I said, hoping my voice sounded steady. I glanced at Mike, who had already moved away from the counter, his easy smile back in place like nothing had happened. When our eyes met again, there was a flicker of something beneath the surface. Something neither of us could pretend hadn't just happened. Dan and Mike fell into their usual banter, talking about work and sports as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I played my part, serving dinner and laughing at their jokes. But the entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling of Mike's gaze lingering on me. When Dan wasn't looking, and I hated how aware of it I was. How much it affected me. As we sat down to eat, I did everything I could to focus on Dan. He was his usual charming self, and I could see how much he enjoyed having his friend over. I loved him, of course I did, but there was something about the way Mike had looked at me earlier, the way his voice had dropped when he said my name, that stayed with me. It wasn't just a casual moment. It felt loaded with possibility. Dangerous in a way I hadn't expected. And the worst part was a small part of me liked it. After dinner, Dan suggested we all head into the living room to watch a game. I could feel myself tightening up, not sure if I wanted to be in the same room as Mike, especially with Dan there, completely unaware of the strange tension building, but I didn't want to make things awkward. So I went along with it. We sat on the couch, Dan on one end, me in the middle, and Mike on the other side. At first, I thought it would be fine. The TV was loud, Dan was focused on the game, and for a little while, it felt like maybe I'd been imagining things earlier. But then slowly, almost imperceptibly, Mike shifted closer to me. Not enough for Dan to notice, but enough for me to feel it. The heat of his body next to mine, the way his knee brushed against mine. When he moved, it sent a pulse of awareness through me. And I could feel my pulse quicken. I tried to focus on the game, but I couldn't. Every small movement Mike made seemed amplified in my mind. The brush of his leg against mine, the way his arm rested a little too close to my shoulder. It was driving me crazy, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend that nothing was happening. I glanced over at him, trying to gauge if he was doing this on purpose. And the look he gave me in return was unmistakable. It wasn't friendly and it wasn't casual. It was full of a quiet hunger, the kind that made my stomach flip and my heart pound in a way it hadn't in years. For a moment, I panicked. What if Dan noticed? What if he could feel the tension between us? But when I looked at him, he was absorbed in the game, oblivious to everything that was happening right beside him. I should have been relieved, but instead it only made the tension worse. I was trapped between them, my husband on one side, my husband's best friend on the other. And all I could think about was how wrong this was, and yet how much I didn't want it to stop. The minutes stretched on, feeling longer and heavier with each passing second. Mike's subtle movements were impossible to ignore now. The way his legs stayed pressed against mine just a little too long, the occasional glance he shot my way filled with something unsaid. I could feel the tension building between us, growing stronger, and with Dan sitting just a few feet away. Completely unaware, the whole situation felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. I told myself that I needed to get up, to make an excuse and leave the room, but I was frozen. Part of me didn't want to go. I hated how I felt about it. How my body was betraying me with its response to Mike's closeness, to the idea that someone was looking at me in a way that I hadn't felt in a long time. Mike's hand rested casually on his knee, so close to mine that I could feel the warmth of his skin. I stared at it, willing myself not to move. But when his fingers twitched, brushing lightly against my leg, a jolt of electricity shot through me. It was barely a touch, just the briefest graze of his skin against mine. But it was enough to send my heart racing. My breath hitched and I glanced at Dan, still oblivious, lost in the game, laughing at something on the screen. I shifted slightly, trying to put some space between us without being too obvious. But Mike didn't back off. His hand moved again, just enough for our fingers to touch, and this time he didn't pull away. Neither did I. It was wrong, and I knew it. I could hear the voice in the back of my head screaming at me to stop, to get up, to do something, anything to put an end to this before it went too far. But I didn't, and I hated myself for it. Karen, Mike whispered so softly that Dan couldn't hear. His voice was low, and when I turned to look at him, there was something in his eyes that made my pulse quicken even more. He wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was serious, intense, and I could feel the pull between us like a magnet drawing us closer. I didn't respond, couldn't trust myself to speak. I just stared at him, my mind racing, my heart pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. And then just as I felt the weight of the moment tipping into something I couldn't take back, Mike shifted away, he cleared his throat. Sitting up straight, and just like that, the spell was broken. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my chest tight with relief and something else. Something like regret. Dan, still completely unaware, looked over at us and smiled. "You two all right? You've been awfully quiet." I forced a laugh, trying to act as if nothing had happened. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, my voice sounding more casual than I felt. "Just tired, I guess." Mike didn't say anything. He just looked at me for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before turning back to the TV. But I could still feel the weight of everything that had passed between us, hanging in the air, unfinished, unresolved. I knew that nothing had actually happened. Not really, but it felt like we'd come so close to something. Neither of us could afford to let happen. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I kept my distance from Mike, barely making eye contact. And as soon as the game was over, I excused myself and went upstairs to bed. I could hear Dan and Mike talking downstairs, laughing like everything was normal. But I couldn't shake the knot in my stomach. When Dan came to bed later, he wrapped his arm around me, pulling me close, and I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. I loved him, there was no question about that. But whatever had almost happened with Mike tonight had shaken me, made me question things I hadn't questioned in years. As I lay there in the dark, Dan steady breathing beside me, I wondered what would happen the next time I saw Mike. Would we pretend like nothing had changed? Could we go back to being the way we were before? Or had something shifted between us forever? I didn't know the answer, but as I closed my eyes, I promised myself that I wouldn't let it go any further. Whatever had almost happened tonight, it would stay in the past. It had to.